The sun was setting over the quiet suburban neighborhood, casting long shadows on the neatly manicured lawns and pristine white fences. Mark Thompson stood on his porch, sipping a cold beer as he watched the neighborhood settle into its usual evening calm. It had been a long day, just another week in the peaceful town where nothing ever seemed out of the ordinary, or so he thought. Across the street, Karen Ellis, the dreaded president of the local homeowners association, HOA, stood in her yard, hands on her hips, glaring at his house. Mark had learned to ignore her over the years, her disapproving stares, her obsessive need for control, and her constant complaints about neighborhood standards. But today, there was something different about the way she was watching him. Mark shrugged it off, probably just another complaint about the lawn or the fence, or maybe the color of my mailbox, he thought. He couldn't have been more wrong. A sudden, blaring siren shattered the evening air. Mark turned his head just as a squad car skidded to a stop in front of his driveway. He blinked, disoriented, his beer sloshing in his hand. Two officers stepped out, their faces stern, their eyes scanning the area. One of them, a tall officer with a no-nonsense expression, approached Mark, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Mr. Thompson?" The officer's voice was cold, professional. Mark's stomach twisted. "Yeah, that's me. What's going on?" The officer looked over his shoulder, then handed Mark a piece of paper. It was a citation, but the details were absurd. Noise complaint, excessive disturbance from property. Excessive disturbance? Mark's mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. He hadn't had a party. He hadn't even played music loud enough to be heard over the hum of the neighborhood. The officer gave him no explanation, just a stern look and a promise that Karen Ellis had made the complaint. Karen Ellis. "Of course. She's the one who called you?" Mark asked, his voice tight with anger, though he kept his composure. The officer didn't answer, just handed over the citation and turned on his heel. The second officer gave him a sympathetic look, but said nothing as he climbed back into the squad car. Mark stood there staring after them as the car pulled away. His mind was racing, heart pounding. That was the first time the HOA president had sent the cops to his house, but it wouldn't be the last. As Mark looked up, Karen Ellis was standing by her window, peering through the blinds, her lips curling into a smile. It was a smile that would haunt him for weeks. Hey, real quick, if you're enjoying the video so far, make sure to hit that like button, share it with friends, and subscribe for more awesome content. And while you're at it, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. All right, let's keep going. It started slowly. Just a whisper, a flicker of something off in the distance. But as the weeks passed, it became impossible to ignore. Mark Thompson had always known Karen Ellis was trouble. But this was something different, something sinister. The first incident had been a loud, over-the-top nuisance, a noise complaint about his lawnmower, which, according to Karen, had disturbed the peace of the neighborhood on a Saturday afternoon. The cops had come, taken his statement, and left, clearly puzzled. They didn't seem to care much, but the frustration had been just a hint, a small irritation that Mark pushed to the back of his mind. Then it happened again. And again. Each time, a new complaint, a new excuse. Parking. His truck was too close. To the curb, blocking the flow of traffic, Karen claimed. Landscaping. His bushes were a half-inch too tall. Noise. He'd been playing music too loudly at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday. Ridiculous, all of it. But Karen Ellis was relentless. By the time the fourth complaint came in, Mark's frustration was starting to boil over. This wasn't just coincidence. This was a pattern. She was making his life a living hell, sending the cops at the drop of a hat, dragging him into petty confrontations. Each time he felt his blood pressure spike, his heart rate quicken. He'd already spent hours talking to the police, explaining that these complaints were absurd. But the look in their eyes, skeptical, tired, told him they weren't buying his side of the story anymore. They were growing tired of him. It wasn't just the cops. The neighbors, once friendly, had started avoiding him. Whispers, sideways glances. They all knew who was behind it. The woman who sat in her ivory tower of power, behind her curtains, keeping tabs on everyone. He could feel her eyes on him every time he stepped outside. Her presence was suffocating, like a shadow that followed him everywhere, and it was only getting darker. One evening, after the sixth visit from the cops, Mark couldn't take it anymore. He slammed his front door shut, pacing his living room. His palms were sweaty, his mind spinning. How was he supposed to live like this? Each knock on his door, each call from the police, felt like another weight pressing down on him. Karen had somehow turned his life into a war zone, a never-ending battle over trivial things that had no real importance. But to her, they were everything. And then, as if on cue, the phone rang. His stomach churned as he saw the name on the screen. "Hello?" he answered, his voice tight. "Mr. Thompson?" It was the police again. The seventh complaint had arrived. This time, they were reporting an unapproved tree removal in his backyard. Mark's grip tightened on the phone, his pulse quickening. He glanced out the window only to see Karen standing across the street, watching him once more, her eyes gleaming with triumph. This wasn't going to stop. It was only going to escalate. And deep down, Mark knew it. He had to make a move. But what? He didn't have the answer yet. But he would. Mark Thompson sat at his kitchen table, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the house. The soft glow of the desk lamp illuminated the pile of documents in front of him. Police reports, citations, photos of his property, each one marked with a red-inked complaint from Karen Ellis, HOA president and self-appointed neighborhood tyrant. Enough is enough, he thought, tapping his fingers nervously against the surface of the table. For years he had kept his distance from the HOA, paid his dues, followed the rules. He had never given Karen Ellis a reason to target him. Not until now. But the string of baseless complaints, the constant harassment from the cops, had pushed him to the edge. No more. He wasn't going to be her punching bag any longer. Mark wasn't a stranger to legal matters. After all, he'd spent a decade working as a private investigator before leaving the field for a quieter life. But the skills he had honed, gathering evidence, dissecting cases, understanding the law, were exactly what he needed now. This wasn't just about petty complaints anymore. This was a battle, one that he was determined to win. And if Karen Ellis wanted a war, he'd bring it to her doorstep. He reached for his phone and dialed the number he'd been avoiding for weeks. The number of a lawyer who specialized in civil rights and harassment cases. A few rings, and the voice of attorney Rachel Diaz crackled through the speaker. "Mark Thompson? What's the problem?" Her voice was sharp but welcoming. "I'm being harassed," Mark said, his voice steady but laced with frustration. "By the HOA president, Karen Ellis. She's sending the cops to my house over nothing. Noise complaints, parking issues, landscaping." He paused, his jaw clenched. "I think she's trying to force me out of this neighborhood. I need help." Rachel didn't hesitate. "You're not the first person to complain about her. I've heard rumors, but this sounds personal. If she's violating your rights, we can do something about it." Mark leaned back in his chair, relief washing over him. This is it, he thought. I'm not alone anymore. Rachel outlined a plan. First, they would need to document everything. Every visit from the police, every complaint filed by Karen. Mark's job would be to collect evidence, photographs, phone records, and anything that proved this harassment was more than just coincidence. Karen was walking a fine line, and Mark was going to make sure she crossed it. Over the next few days, Mark's life turned into a meticulous process of documentation. He bought a small camera and set it up on his front porch, capturing footage of Karen's every move. Every time the police came to his door, he logged it in his computer, keeping detailed records. He could feel the shift inside him, a change from a man under siege to a man who was now in control. The power had shifted. Karen Ellis was no longer the puppet master. But as Mark continued his preparations, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Late one night, as he was going through his notes, his phone buzzed with a new message. The name on the screen made his stomach lurch. It was a text from an unknown number. "I know what you're doing. Don't think you can win this. I always get what I want." His fingers froze above the keyboard, the message burning into his mind. It was Karen. The gloves were off. Mark's resolve hardened. He wasn't going to back down. But Karen Ellis had just made a dangerous mistake. She had just declared war, and Mark Thompson was ready to fight back. The sun had barely risen, but Mark Thompson was already wide awake. He stared at the pile of papers on his kitchen table, the evidence he'd painstakingly gathered over the last few weeks. Each document, each photograph, told the story of his growing conflict with Karen Ellis. Stories of harassment, manipulation, and now something far more sinister. It was quiet. Too quiet. Mark had expected another visit from the cops, but it had been a few days since his last confrontation. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the table as his thoughts raced. Karen had to know he was ready. She had to know that he was fighting back. And in her mind, that made him a target. He didn't have long to wait. A knock on his door shattered the stillness, sharp and insistent. Mark stood, his heart already pounding as he moved toward the door. He wasn't surprised to see the flashing lights of a squad car parked at the curb. But this time, something was different. Two officers stood at the doorstep, one holding a clipboard. The older officer spoke first, his tone clipped, formal. "Mr. Thompson," he said, "we have a complaint. You've been seen disturbing the peace." Mark narrowed his eyes, his pulse quickening. Disturbing the peace? Again? His mind flashed back to the last few encounters. This was getting ridiculous. But this time the officer wasn't handing him a simple citation. The clipboard was filled with a set of official-looking documents. "We have a court order," the officer continued, his eyes never meeting Mark's. "A restraining order filed against you by Karen Ellis. She claims you've been threatening her safety." Mark felt a knot tighten in his stomach. A restraining order? He couldn't believe it. This wasn't just a baseless complaint anymore. This was something much more serious. Karen had gone straight for the jugular. The accusation was nothing more than a fabrication, but the officers, looking uncomfortable but resolute, handed him the papers. Mark's mind raced. "She's getting desperate," he thought, "but this is exactly what I need." Before he could speak, the younger officer shifted uncomfortably on his feet. "Mr. Thompson, the order is valid. We're going to need you to vacate the premises for the time being. Please pack your things." "Hold on," Mark said sharply, stepping forward. "I don't know who you're listening to, but this is a setup. I've been documenting everything, every complaint, every officer visit. I've got proof that she's been harassing me." The older officer's gaze hardened. "You'll have your chance to explain in court." He turned, signaling to his partner. "We'll be back if there's further trouble." As the cops walked away, Mark's mind was spinning, but the adrenaline coursing through him gave him clarity. Karen thinks she's got me cornered. But she was wrong. He quickly returned to his living room, where his hidden camera footage was, ready to be reviewed. Mark's hands moved with practiced precision as he pulled up the recording from last night. What he saw made his blood run cold. Karen, herself, was on his property, standing right by his fence, talking to one of the officers from the last complaint. She had planted the idea of the restraining order. This was more than harassment. It was a full-on conspiracy. Mark's mind raced with one thought. She's going down, but how? How could he turn the tables? He wasn't just going to fight this battle in court. He was going to expose Karen for the liar she truly was. With a calmness he hadn't felt in days, Mark began drafting his next move. The stage was set, and he was about to make sure the lights fell squarely on Karen Ellis. The soft glow of Mark Thompson's laptop screen lit up his face as he leaned forward, his fingers typing rapidly on the keyboard. The hum of the coffee machine in the background was the only sound, a stark contrast to the racing thoughts swirling in his head. He had known that this wasn't going to be an easy fight. But now, the stakes had changed. Karen Ellis, the seemingly perfect HOA president with a smile that could win over anyone, was anything but. Mark had started digging, and he wasn't just looking for legal loopholes or technicalities. No, he needed something far juicier than that. Something to make sure she'd never come after him again. He had asked Rachel Diaz, his lawyer, to dig into Karen's past. It wasn't long before Rachel found something interesting. It started small, just a mention in an old local news article about a real estate dispute. But as they dug deeper, the pieces began to form a disturbing picture. Mark sat back, staring at the collection of files now spread out across his dining table. One of the first things they uncovered was Karen's history of questionable financial decisions. An array of failed business ventures, dodgy investments, and more than a few legal threats that had quietly disappeared, buried by high-priced settlements. It was clear she had always walked the fine line between legality and deceit. But something bigger was lurking just beneath the surface. Rachel had found a connection between Karen and several shady contractors who had worked in the neighborhood, some of whom had been implicated in various city zoning scandals. But it was one particular name that caught Mark's attention: Victor Harris. Mark leaned closer to the screen, his eyes narrowing as he read the report again. Victor Harris was a well-known figure in local criminal circles, someone whose name had been linked to underground dealings in the area. And Karen Ellis, there it was in black and white, had signed contracts with him for landscaping projects in the past. This is it, Mark thought, feeling a chill run down his spine. This could be the key to everything. A knock at the door startled him, and he quickly minimized the browser window, glancing toward the front entrance. He had been expecting Rachel, but it wasn't her. He stood, moved to the door cautiously, and opened it just a crack. His heart skipped a beat when he saw who was standing there. Officer Jake Collins, the younger cop who had visited his home during the most recent complaint. "Mr. Thompson," the officer said, his tone lower than usual, almost conspiratorial. "I need to talk to you. It's about Karen Ellis." Mark didn't know whether to trust him. He had no idea if the officer was a pawn in Karen's game or if this was a genuine opportunity. He hesitated, his instincts kicking in, but then stepped aside, allowing Collins into his home. The officer closed the door behind him, and Mark led him into the living room, trying to maintain his cool. "I know this isn't official, but I think you need to know something," Collins said, his voice hushed. "Karen's been getting too comfortable. She's been working with some unsavory characters. You might have already come across their names, but there's more, a lot more. I've been looking into her too. She's dirty. I can't do anything officially, but if you have the right leverage, I'll back you up." Mark felt his pulse quicken. This was unexpected. He hadn't anticipated anyone inside the system would be willing to turn on Karen. It was all falling into place. The investigation, the evidence, the secret connections. But Mark wasn't ready to celebrate just yet. Collins leaned in, his voice almost a whisper. "Keep your eyes open. This isn't over yet." Before Mark could respond, the officer turned and walked out as quickly as he had come, leaving behind a faint air of mystery. Mark stood there for a moment, processing what he had just heard. Leverage, he thought. He's right. I have something on her now. But this was just the beginning. The pieces were falling into place, and Mark was starting to feel the heat on Karen Ellis. He wasn't going to back down now, but with every piece of dirt he uncovered, the more dangerous the game became. And Karen, he realized, wasn't going down without a fight. The tension was rising. The final move was near. and he was ready to make his next step, one that would force Karen to face her lies. But Mark knew better than anyone. The closer you got to the truth, the darker and more dangerous the path became. And Karen was just one step away from losing everything. The air was thick with tension. Mark Thompson stood at his front door, his hand gripping the cold metal of the doorknob as his eyes fixed on the flashing lights of the squad car parked at the curb. He had been expecting this moment. He just hadn't anticipated how soon it would come. This time, Karen Ellis wasn't just playing her usual game of petty complaints. No, she had pulled out all the stops. A single knock at the door sent a jolt of electricity through Mark's spine. He opened it slowly, the door creaking on its hinges, and found two familiar faces standing on his porch. Officer Collins was back, but this time he wasn't alone. Beside him stood another officer, one Mark didn't recognize. "We've got a call about an illegal construction on your property," Officer Collins said, his voice almost too calm, like he was just going through the motions. But Mark knew better. This was the final move in Karen's twisted game. Illegal construction? Mark's voice was low, controlled. He knew this accusation was as fabricated as every other one Karen had lodged against him. But he wasn't about to let them walk over him again. "Yeah," the officer continued, scanning Mark's face for any sign of guilt. "She claims you're building without the proper permits. We need to inspect the property." Mark didn't flinch. He had anticipated this, but he wasn't going to let Karen win. Not now, not ever. "I don't know who's been feeding you this nonsense," Mark said coolly, "but I've got something that says otherwise. I've been documenting every single complaint you've made, and I've got proof that you've been harassing me for weeks. Now you're coming here with a baseless accusation." The officer shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Collins, who gave him a subtle nod. "Mr. Thompson, we don't want to escalate this. We're just doing our job." Mark's eyes narrowed. Just doing our job. Those words stung like a slap in the face. They had been Karen's mouthpieces for far too long. It was time to turn the tables. "I don't think you understand," Mark said, stepping aside and motioning for them to enter. "I've had enough. You're not going to play her game anymore." He led them into his living room, where the table was covered in files, photographs, and recordings. It was an archive of everything Karen had tried to do to him. Each false accusation, each visit from the cops. He'd been meticulous in his documentation, and now it was time to use it. Mark grabbed the folder marked Evidence from the table and opened it, pulling out a series of photos. He slid them across the table toward the officers. "This is a picture of Karen Ellis standing on my property, in direct violation of my rights, just days ago. Here's a video of her talking to one of the officers who filed the last complaint. And here's a recorded phone call where she explicitly admits to harassing me." Collins's jaw tightened. The silence that followed was thick, as if the weight of Mark's evidence was hanging over them. The officers exchanged an uneasy glance. "You can't just accuse someone—" Mark cut him off, his voice sharp. "I'm not accusing anyone, officer. I'm showing you the truth. Karen Ellis has been using her position as HOA president to abuse her power, and now she's crossing the line." The new officer opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say another word, Collins raised a hand, silencing him. The older officer's face betrayed a flicker of guilt. "Look, Mr. Thompson, I'm not blind. But we can't just ignore the official orders. We've got to investigate." "I've already done the investigation for you," Mark replied. "You're not here to investigate. You're here to cover up Karen's mess. And I'm not letting that happen." The finality in Mark's voice hung in the air. Collins took a step back, his eyes scanning the evidence, as if weighing his options. The younger officer fidgeted, clearly uncomfortable in the face of this mounting pressure. Mark's heart pounded in his chest. He knew the moment had arrived. The moment when Karen's lies would finally be exposed, when her reign of terror would end. Then, just as the officers stood there, seemingly at a crossroads, the door slammed open. Rachel Diaz, Mark's lawyer, strode in, her expression fierce, eyes locked on the officers with an undeniable authority. "Are we done here, gentlemen?" she asked, her tone leaving no room for doubt. "Because I have a court order right here that demands you cease and desist any further harassment against my client." The tension in the room could have been cut with a knife. The officers stood frozen, staring at the piece of paper she handed them, each of them realizing they were caught in a web of lies too tangled to escape. "You've been warned," Rachel added, her gaze never leaving them. "Any more attempts to interfere with Mr. Thompson's life, and we'll be pressing charges. This harassment ends today." Mark couldn't help but feel a sense of relief wash over him, but there was no time to savor the victory. Karen was still out there, and Mark knew this showdown wasn't over. Not yet. But as the officers backed out of his house, defeated, a small victory flickered in the corner of his mind. The game was no longer hers to control. The tables had turned, and Karen Ellis was about to learn the hard way that when you push someone too far, there's always a breaking point. Mark had just found his. The storm had been brewing for weeks. Mark could feel it in the air now, thick with anticipation and the sharp sting of a final reckoning. The truth was out, and it was just a matter of time before Karen Ellis's web of lies and corruption unraveled completely. The feeling was intoxicating, but there was no room for complacency. This was a battle, not a victory lap. Mark sat in his kitchen, his eyes glued to the screen of his laptop, scanning the latest news report. He had just received the final piece of evidence that would blow this entire charade wide open. The local news anchor's voice cut through the silence. Investigations into the shady dealings of local HOA president Karen Ellis have taken a surprising turn. Sources inside the HOA and multiple whistleblowers have come forward, claiming Ellis was not only using her position to intimidate homeowners, but also embezzling funds, forging signatures on documents, and accepting bribes in exchange for favoritism. The situation is unraveling fast, and authorities are now looking into multiple criminal charges. A cold smile crept across Mark's face. It was finally happening. Karen Ellis had been playing a dangerous game for too long, exploiting her position to harass innocent residents, all while lining her own pockets. She thought she could control everything, manipulate the system, bully her neighbors, and get away with it. But Mark had been methodical, gathering evidence, collecting stories, and patiently waiting for the moment when it would all come crashing down. As the report continued, Mark's phone buzzed on the table. It was a text from Rachel, his lawyer. He opened it, and his heart skipped a beat. They just raided her office. "The evidence is there. We have her." The phone slipped from his hand, the weight of her downfall settling over him like a heavy fog. This wasn't just a win. It was the kind of victory that would leave a lasting scar. Karen had played with fire, and now she was about to get burned. The next few days were a blur of interviews, media attention, and mounting pressure on Karen as her empire crumbled. Her lies began to spiral, each revelation more damaging than the last. It came out that she'd been using the HOA's funds for personal gain, taking lavish vacations, buying expensive gifts for her allies, and even funneling money into accounts linked to corrupt businesses. The truth hit the headlines, and there was no going back for her now. But the most damning piece of the puzzle came when Mark's lawyer uncovered a hidden ledger, one that showed Karen had been orchestrating the false police reports against Mark for months, all to keep him in check, all to silence him. The ledger, filled with names and dates, proved she had been using her position not just to harass, but to manipulate law enforcement, bribing officers to take action on her behalf. The dominoes were falling, and Mark could feel the tension in the air as the authorities moved in. He had no sympathy for Karen, not after everything she'd done, but there was something almost poetic about it. She had thought she was untouchable, that her power could shield her from the consequences of her actions. But now, That very power had become her downfall. Later that evening, Mark watched the footage of Karen's arrest on TV. She was being escorted out of her mansion in handcuffs, her face pale, her eyes wide with shock. She had been caught, and the weight of her corruption had caught up to her in a way no one could have predicted. Mark leaned back in his chair, letting out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It's over. The reign of terror she'd imposed on his life, and on the lives of so many others, was finally over. The relief was palpable, but there was still a sense of disbelief. How had it come to this? As the news report continued, detailing the charges against her, Mark's thoughts drifted to the countless sleepless nights he had spent fighting back, the days of uncertainty, the quiet anger that had fueled him to take a stand, and now finally it had all paid off. But even as he watched the final scenes unfold, Karen being led to a squad car, the reporters shouting questions that went unanswered, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. There were still many unanswered questions, and there would be consequences that stretched far beyond Karen's arrest. This was only the first chapter of a much bigger story. And Mark was ready for whatever came next. The fall of Karen Ellis had been swift, but her legacy of abuse and corruption would linger long after the headlines faded. Mark wasn't just a survivor anymore. He was the one who had taken control of his own narrative, and in doing so, he had brought down a villain who thought she could never be touched. But as he sat there, watching the news, he realized one thing. With certainty, victory wasn't just about the fall. It was about what came after. And he wasn't finished yet. The sound of handcuffs clinking echoed through the courthouse as Karen Ellis, former HOA president, was led away by the officers. Her face was pale, her eyes vacant, as though the weight of her downfall had yet to fully sink in. Mark watched from the back of the courtroom, his pulse steady, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. The day had arrived, and with it, the moment he had been waiting for. Justice. The courtroom was packed, the tension in the air thick with anticipation. The judge read the charges aloud: embezzlement, bribery, abuse of power, and a host of others. Mark's lawyer, Rachel, had done her part, digging into the dark corners of Karen's life and bringing to light every single piece of incriminating evidence. And now, here they were, the last chapter of a long, painful saga that had consumed Mark's life for months. Karen's face contorted as the judge banged the gavel, sentencing her to multiple years in prison. The room fell silent save for the faint shuffling of papers and the soft click of the courtroom cameras. For a moment it felt unreal. Mark had spent so long in the grip of fear and uncertainty, constantly looking over his shoulder wondering when Karen would strike next. But now, as he sat there, watching the woman who had tried to destroy his life be taken away, he couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. Rachel gave him a small nod from across the room, her expression one of quiet satisfaction. They had won. Against all odds, they had won. The pieces had fallen into place, and the world could finally see Karen for what she truly was: a manipulative, corrupt individual who had taken advantage of her position for far too long. As the courtroom emptied, Mark walked out into the bright sunlight, the weight of the last few months lifting from his shoulders with each step. The day was clear, the air crisp, as if the world itself was exhaling in relief. He hadn't realized just how much the tension had eaten away at him until now, until the moment he knew that it was over. Karen would be locked away for a long time, but her crimes were far-reaching, a ripple effect that had affected so many in the community. Mark's neighbors, who had once lived in fear of her wrath, were already beginning to rebuild their lives, to reclaim their sense of safety. The HOA, once a corrupt and oppressive force, was now under investigation, with more members being scrutinized for their involvement in Karen's schemes. It wasn't just Karen who had to face the consequences, it was the entire system of power that had allowed her to thrive. Mark sat on the steps of the courthouse, his mind racing through the events, Of the last few weeks, the investigation, the tension, the countless times he had been pushed to the edge, it had all led to this. His victory wasn't just a personal triumph. It was a victory for everyone who had ever felt powerless, for everyone who had ever been abused by those in power. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of it all settle in. It was a bitter victory, though. He had come face to face with the ugly truth about power and corruption, the way it twisted people, turning them into something unrecognizable. He had fought for justice, but at what cost? What did it take to bring someone like Karen to justice? How many lives had been ruined in the process? The past months had forced Mark to confront the darker side of his own nature, the part of him that wanted revenge, that thirsted for justice to be served in the most dramatic of ways. But now, standing on the steps, watching the world move on without him, he realized something profound. There would always be more battles, more injustices, more corruption. But sometimes, the most important thing was simply to stand up and fight, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. As he walked away from the courthouse, the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him, he realized that he wasn't the same man who had been dragged into this battle months ago. He had grown stronger, more resilient. And though the fight had been exhausting, he had come out on the other side with his integrity intact. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the street. Mark's phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking the silence. It was a message from his neighbor, Mike. "The HOA's gone, man. We're free." A smile tugged at Mark's lips as he pocketed the phone. He didn't need to say anything. He didn't need to prove anything. The battle was over, and the future, though uncertain, was his to shape. And as he looked toward the horizon, a new sense of peace washed over him. He had fought for what was right, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like he could finally breathe. The journey had been long, but it was over. And now Mark was ready for whatever came next. Justice had been served, and he was finally free. If you enjoyed this video and want to see the next part, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated. See you in the next one. Your support means the world.